Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to Demiplanar with B. Dave Walters. And today we have the man himself, the myth, the legend, hailing from parts unknown, Brennan Lee Mulligan.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Mr. B. Dave Walters. A pleasure as always.
Man, I don't think people realize how you and I talk to each other, and we will chew up an hour without blinking. So I want to get right into it, but I'm going to say two things real quick. Tune in tomorrow at 9 o'clock Pacific for our first Demiplane Dev Update with Mr. Adam Bradford. We have a significant announcement, and then we have sub-announcements. And maybe you might even see me there, maybe announcing something. I don't know. But tomorrow, 9 Pacific, right here on twitch.tv/Demiplane. We will be doing that, so make sure you come back to see it. You know what's funny? Demiplane RPG. Yeah, so we'll do that then. But we're doing a different thing now. Right now, the thing we're doing is talking with Brennan Lee Mulligan. So if you have any questions for Brennan or myself, put it in chat with the capital question in front of it. Just write question in big letters. We got people that will grab it for us. I'm going to pull it out and have it here in my document for me. And we will get to it. So let's just jump in. Hello, Brennan.
Hello. Oh, I'm so happy to be here. How about it? This is always a pleasure and an honor.
For someone who may be, new to the internet, that they just made their way on, stumbled in from the desert and turned this on. Who are you, sir, and where might people know you from?
First of all, you still have time. Get away. Get away from the internet. You don't have to be here. That's my first thing I would say to that person. Whatever moss-covered hut you just arrived here from, whatever twee fantasy little elfin shack. Turn back. Then I would say, hello, my name is Brennan Lee Mulligan. I'm the Dungeon Master for Dimension 20, which is a D&D 5e actual play show. Now other games as well, just tabletop role-playing actual play show that appears on Dropout.tv, which is College Humor streaming platform. You can also find my work on College Humor, where I do a bunch of CEO sketches and other sketches and stuff like that. And youtube.com/dimension20 show. That's where you can find me. Probably if you're finding me playing tabletop games with people or yelling into a camera pretending to be a businessman.
We did an episode of Adventuring Academy, your show like this, on Dimension 20 way before the pandemic, so like 2 years ago. And literally not a week goes by that someone doesn't hit me up asking me something from our conversation on that show. So here we go. Now we need to create new long tail content, Brennan.
Yeah. A little medal of esteem there, by the way. My wonderful mom, who was just out here in Los Angeles visiting not too long ago, your Adventuring Academy, one of her all-timers. She's a huge B. Dave fan. B. Dave Walters has the Elaine Lee stamp of approval.
I'm an Elaine Lee fan, not only from the things you've told me about her over time, but that she blessed us with you, Brennan Lee Mulligan.
Shucks.
What? While we're in the flattery portion of this interview, let me tell y'all something. So here's how I met Brennan. Which now, I reject linear time. It's an illusion. I feel like it was 6 months ago, but it must have been like 3 years ago or more. Yeah. Erica Ishii introduced me to you because at the time you were in development on The Unsleeping City. And you wanted to do basically a sensitivity read on some of the things that you were working on, and had the conversation. Conversation went great, but I just want to point out to you guys, in this business, there are some true gems in people that walk their talk, and more importantly, walk their talk when no one is looking. And Brennan Lee Mulligan is one of those people. And it's so often that you only hear about people when it turns out they're terrible. When you're like, hey, that guy you thought was cool, yeah, he eats kittens, So I just want to make sure I say that Brennan Lee Mulligan is the best person, and however good you think he is from his cherubic-like demeanor, he is actually better.
Well, shit.
You really are turning red. It's adorable. Got him. I got him, everybody. I got him. all the LA by Night fans that wanted revenge from this season. I got him.
I know it was so. I've had an amazing time on LA by Night this season. I wanted to play with Victor Temple so bad because I just knew because. I did my whole villain prep. I was like, okay, how am I going to come at sideways? And I was like, okay, Annabelle's a true believer. You can get into her head really well. She's got the mental handholds of like, here's how you would grab that and twist that. And I was looking at Victor Temple and I was like, I got nothing. That is
I felt the exact same way. So no spoilers, but just to give you all some insight, LA by Night, season 5 is our last season. In fact, we only have one more episode. It is this Friday, and that is the end of our chronicle. This season, Brennan has been on as an adversarial opponent. I'll just say that. I'll be that vague. And I felt the same way, man. The whole time I was like, if we do one of these things, where is this gonna go? Like the whole time I was like, yeah. But if you know where it went, you know where it went. If you don't know, I'm not gonna spoil it for you. But you should watch it because he is delightfully awful.
Oh shucks, I know. I so wanted to be in scenes with you this season. I just cause for that thing of because again, Erika Ishii is so brilliant, and she plays a character that has these like tortured, like in the ways that we all do this sort of inconsistencies where there are weird insecurities or guilts that as playing a very manipulative character, that's what you're looking for to grab onto. And I just looked at Victor Temple and anything I could think to say of like, don't you think, Victor, that you're a little bit like this? I couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't just get a flat, yeah.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, right, yeah. It's a feature, not a bug. Yeah. No, it was definitely incredible. And seeing you and Taliesin both being so awful but in very different ways was just
shucks.
Chef's kiss. Chef's kiss. Well, that actually let's dive a little into this because again the questions are just mounting over here, but I'm like, sure. But I got one for myself. I do. I think my original niche was kind of, high fantasy, high adventure, and then, became more horror because of, Vampire and Black Dice Society and Ravenloft. And I have some comedic stuff coming up, more improv based, which you yourself gave me the recommendation of this book, which I will be diving into. But what do you think is the intersection of comedy and horror?
Wow, what a great question. This question really launched into, I feel like I had heard from very learned, intelligent people, film professors, old comedian. My dad was a stand-up comic. I had heard a couple times in my life, like, oh, the rhythms of horror and comedy are very similar. I think it really launched into the public consciousness that these two things are basically like, I don't know how to put it. They're like two different, the same words in two different fonts almost, right? It's like around the time that Get Out came out, where people were like, oh my God, this is like incredibly chilling. And the director of that is Jordan Peele, who up to that point had, in my opinion, like the most flawless sketch show of the last, like Key and Peele is and also the book you're holding in your hand, by the way, one of the founders of UCB was the head writer for Key and Peele for many, many years. So Key and Peele is a clinic in like that game style of like following the game of a sketch, right? So Key and Peele, if you look at that and you're like, oh my God, listen, like incredible world-class comedian goes and immediately directs one of the most exciting horror films that truly like, break, because horror has its own dedicated fan base, and Get Out broke out of that. It was not just a hit amongst horror fans, right? So I feel like a bunch of conversations started around that time. I'm immediately answering like the question around the question. But just to give context, that's when I think you started to see people way talk about what are the connections between horror and comedy, right? And what both of them have in common is a manipulation of expectation that then erupts into some kind of surprise, right? That could be something in horror just as simple as a jump scare, but it's also there's just a feeling of what is the relationship in horror between tension and actual fear, right? Of like your apprehension or anxiety around something horrifying, and then the actual horrifying thing approaching. And then in comedy, you have expectation and subversion. So the way to make people think about that, this is getting really into the deep end of the nitty gritty of
let's do it, man. Let's go in.
Some people, there's a great article that was talking about like what is comedy. My understanding of comedy really advanced when I stopped listening to comedians and started reading neurology and psychology about the nature of what humor is, right? And some people will be like, oh, well, comedy is surprise, right? Comedy is a sort of like surprise coming in. That's not quite it, because there's lots of things that are surprising that won't make you laugh. What the relationship between expectation and subversion, aka setup and punchline, which is another way to think about it, right? Is that there's a relationship between the type of tension or expectation or anxiety you're creating and what kind of thing would burst through that or shatter that, either to create a moment of real fear in horror or to create a moment of laughter if you're trying to go for comedy. An example of like why we wouldn't just say that anything surprising is funny. If you're driving along in your car and suddenly get hit by another car, that's not necessarily funny. That could just be sad or whatever. It also might not necessarily be terrifying to happen, because maybe you just were totally not paying attention, and by the time you realize this may even happened, you're already like the crash is over, right? But what would make a car crash what would make a surprising car crash funny? Probably someone driving in the car being like, I'm the best driver in the world. You can blow through these stop signs in this neighborhood. It's not a big deal. Oh God! That moment of like, oh, so what does that mean? It means that basically like when you're trying to create a joke, you are trying to set up, I forget what it is. A comedian it gives you a set of information in their setup, right? If you're an improviser, you would call that the baseline reality of your scene. But a comedian is trying to give you a set of information. We'll call it a setup, right? What they need that set of information to do is to make the audience form an expectation of what the logical results of that information would be. Then the trick is completed when they do something that shatters your expectation without contradicting the original information. That's the real trick, right? Is I do the setup and then something happens that really it goes counter to what you thought was going to happen, but it doesn't contradict the actual facts that I gave you. So that's comedy, and that has a very similar rhythm to it in horror of I need to set up that you're in danger because I need to create a feeling of dread or tension or anxiety. And then I have to scare you after I already told you that I was going to scare you, which is really hard to do. But I need to scare you in a way that like it happens a beat after or a beat before, or in some way you weren't thinking. It's the classic, it's the Jurassic Park, which is really honestly a horror movie. It's just a very, very brightly colored, very vibrant horror movie. The Muldoon, the hunter, looking and the sweat's dripping, and he's looking and he sees a velociraptor, and you're like, oh, that's it. And then clever girl next to his. That is literally almost a physical representation of what's happening mentally, whether you're telling a joke or trying to scare someone. So that would be my answer, is like the clever girl, that structure of whoop, it comes sideways at you. That's the same as a joke or a scare.
Yeah, that it's got to be simultaneously surprising but inevitable, which is that kind of transcends genre. What's interesting to me, obviously I agree with everything you just said, but what's interesting to me, especially in film and television and things like that, is comedy is cultural and contextual, but horror isn't. That's why horror movies, it is very easy to transcend genre and region and even language, in the sense that we all comprehend that a person chasing you with an axe is generally negative, but why this is funny, why he's the world's best driver and blew through a stop sign you need to comprehend, at least roughly, how was this supposed to work? What was he supposed to do? Did that red octagon, that meant that or octahedron, I guess, that meant stop. You know what I mean? So it's interesting that, yes, there are these universal beats in the flow of where I'm waving your emotions, and yet you require more context, like your CEO sketches, those things are funny because we're all Western capitalists, we get the subtext, it's like the subtext is prepackaged, and it's almost like, do you think horror just requires less subtext? Because things like The Ring came from Japan over this way and work completely. But if we have a drama about the futility of, working 90-hour weeks as an unfulfilled, Japanese businessman, may or may not land.
It's a really interesting, it's like there's an element there where there's like, is fear just a more primal emotion than humor? I might say so. I think that's probably just part of the math, right? Fear is like, what percentage of the animal kingdom has some version of fear? Like all of
the ones that have survived.
The ones that have survived, right? And then what percentage of animals have a sense of humor? It's a narrower sliver of the biological of the animal kingdom that because it requires a tremendous amount of intelligence. I forget, there was some animal biologist that was talking about, like, obviously lots of animals do have a sense of humor, even a very rudimentary one, even if they don't laugh or whatever, but they do have that, like, what did they say was necessary for a sense of humor? They said the ability to form an expectation, have that expectation subverted, and realize that is okay. Like there was there was a psychologist who wasn't talking about what humor is, but wrote an essay about the purpose that it serves. And the term they used that I really love was chaos training. They basically said this is chaos training. And what they meant was, they were like, one of humans' most fundamental survival tactics is the ability to make predictions about the future, right? We do that all the time, every way, constantly. We are also horrendously bad at it. So it's a tool that we're constantly using that is not that reliable. And as a result of that, the intense psychic wear and tear of this thing that we need to continually do that we're not that good at, you need some kind of hardened coating around your mind to protect you from how constantly mistaken we are and how constantly things don't go as expected. And so that idea of, a person's walking in a straight line, and that straight and even line is interrupted by a banana peel, but we suddenly know, like, okay, that didn't go as expected, but I'm actually okay. Like the person's not that hurt, right? It gives you that idea of, like, this is a form of mental fortitude for how often we are disappointed or upset by things not going the way we thought they would go. And so in other words, like you're saying, that is very cool, and I think very universal to human beings. But like you're saying, that is way more refined software than fear. Fear is way more primal than the kind of complex thing that's going on that would make you laugh at something.
I keep turning my head because my list of questions is over here. I'm not like zoning out, checking Instagram while you're talking to me. That's where the questions are. But you bring up another interesting point, because you're brilliant, that
oh shucks.
One of the things that I'm always saying is that storytelling is what makes us human. Everything we do, some other animal does. And in the fullness of time, when we know what crows and dolphins and elephants are saying to each other, maybe they're doing it too. But as of this exact second, we're the only ones. The fact that we can sit around a fireplace and talk about the labors of Hercules and take meaningful, actionable insight about life in our own journey into individuation is something that is uniquely human, at least for the time being. That's why you keep getting that hero with 1,000 faces. We keep telling that same story because it's the general trajectory we've all got to go through life. That taking comedy as essentially disaster prep, chaos training, which I wrote down. Also, that'd be a really great name for a show. None of you take that. That's my show name now. Is, that is an incredible insight. You know what I mean? That it's like, one of my favorite quotes, and it's a C.S. Lewis quote, and I'm paraphrasing, that it's, since we know children are going to encounter monsters, then let's make sure they've heard stories of great heroes. It's like, we already know life is going to be hard. Let's make sure they hear about people overcoming things that are hard.
Yes.
In this idea that comedy is in a way insulating us for that. When you dive into it, we're literally wired for it, that it releases endorphins, like your brain, will reward you with a good laugh. Is wild.
Yeah. We know that people without senses of humor are incredibly brittle, mentally brittle against disappointment, sudden changes in plans, that suffer from anxiety at a way worse level. There's an interesting thing here, because some people will be like, well, if comedy is supposed to be this panacea against anxiety or depression, why are there so many comedians that have struggled with anxiety and depression? But that's kind of your answer. Those are people who are self-medicating, right? In other words, if you struggle with that, you do actually seek that out, because it is a incredible survival strategy, coping mechanism, defense mechanism, whatever you want to call it. And I don't say those in a pejorative way.
Sure.
Having mechanisms for defense is great. Defend yourself. It's just one of those things that there are a lot of positives that come with it. And the studies have shown the downsides of, and I think we all know how we've all met and known humorless people, and how at the mercy of chaos they are, that things don't roll off their back, that they are, again, very disappointable. And it's that's an intense thing that I don't know how I would get through life if I did not have a sense of humor.
I agree. Let me just pitch you a character concept. Malkavian stand-up comic. Just saying. Tumble that around in your noodle.
Malkavian stand-up comic. Oh my God. That's so fun.
I'm a detour here slightly to at least some of the questions, because again, they keep coming in. And if you joined us late, if you have a question for Brennan, question for me, put it in chat with the capital question in front of it, right? Question in all caps. They'll capture it and they'll give it to me on my list over here. So these are kind of intermittent from, I'll try to line them up with what we're talking about, but hey, here we go. Before a campaign starts, do you have an idea about which NPCs you create might become favorites, like Giliar? Or when you find one that your players latch on to, do you intentionally increase their presence or importance?
It's a great question.
That's from TBK Zord, by the way. What's up, TBK
Thanks,
Zord?
TBK Zord. That's a great question. What I would say is, I think there's an interesting aspect of this question. Okay, so to your question, I don't know which NPCs are going to be popular or not beforehand. The Sam Smorkel effect is real, right? the weird little goblin you make up, off the cuff is always going to be, the most beloved. No matter how much work you put, it's almost a curse. If you find yourself doing DM prep and you're putting a lot of mustard on an NPC, guaranteed they're going to have no questions about that NPC.
They won't care, or they might just execute them instantly. You know what I mean?
Instantly.
They're like, this person seems significant. Finger a death.
Instantly.
Yeah.
So I would say too that everyone is engaged in world building at the table. Even the players are engaged in world building, and you all have these different tools. I think Matt Colville had a great way of talking, underline that one of the key tools of a dungeon master that you're not liable to think of, I feel like, as a DM all the time. It was control over the flow of time. Right? That's a thing that PCs really can't do. PCs, generally speaking, don't go, and we cut from here to somewhere else.
Right.
PCs can't slow down a moment or speed up a day. That is a uniquely DM power to have. And it really helps my DMing to start thinking of that as that is one of your major tools on your tool belt, is control over the passage of time. Right. Similarly, what PCs should know is, as like their major tool on their tool belt is focus.
Mm-hmm.
Because PCs are the main character, the story follows them, but it actually also follows something else, which is not just them. It follows their attention.
Mm-hmm.
It follows what they are focusing on. So if you're in a game and your PCs are, let's say you have like a wizard and a cleric that have high religion and arcana, you're going to be world building way more of the secret magical nature of your setting than the game with a rogue and a fighter who just have, like athletics and stealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is that? Why would that be the case? Why couldn't you make up more arcana in one and the other? Because over the course of actual play sessions, those characters are going to be rolling their good stats. They're going to be asking questions that their characters are inclined to ask. And you will be amazed that as you get those arcana and religion questions over and over, you're going to be doing more world building. Now, are you the one answering those questions? Sure. But the PCs are doing the world building as well because they're pointing the spotlight at the shadows that they want to investigate. They're saying, what's over here, right? So in terms of NPCs, you're saying, like, do you just increase the NPC that's present based on the player characters? Yes, of course. And the PCs know that. The PCs know that who they choose to interact with is going to get more screen time. But just by definition, right? Mm-hmm. So I think as a player character, if there's an NPC that you love, they're gonna get more screen time because you're seeking out interactions with them. So that PC focus is an incredible building block of how these tabletop universes come to life.
I completely agree with you. I up to and including the ones that you just come up with off the dome, usually being the ones that last the longest. I don't always have NPCs that I feel like they're gonna like more, but I definitely have some NPCs that I know that I'm gonna like more, that I'm gonna like.
Yes.
Interested in, more interested in this one or that one. But I do think kind of seeing their eyes light up makes me like that one more. Like maybe I thought this one was a throwaway, but you guys, all right, here's Wonderwall. I will say I had two significant experiences in my time. One was in a Pathfinder game. I ran a Pathfinder game for 4 years where they went from level 1 to level 20 and all 10 mythic tiers. Like, we did the whole thing.
Wow.
And one of the characters was a bard who was secretly evil. And he was secretly charming monsters and people and stuff like that. And had them he was intentionally charming monsters, but they didn't know he was evil. So they had a couple of monsters that they'd gotten over time, and one of them was a succubus named Karanda. And what he didn't know is succubus can cast charm monster at will. So she charmed literally everyone in the party but him. And I'd pulled them all aside and let them know that she has you under her thrall, but she didn't exert it because, they're all in the service of him. So his charm broke on her before her charm broke on them, and that went an interesting way. But with that character, what I did over time was the ones that they originally had magically, I had come to truly become friends with them, and them truly become friends with these monsters. And it was a surprisingly meaningful interaction that, grew over time for all of us. The second thing was, I do a lot of level 20 D&D. And, there's not a ton of enemies that you can challenge people with at level 20. And in one of the Patreon games, they were going to fight Tiamat. And I had Tiamat show up as the Dark Lady. So she's like talking to him and kind of traveling with them. And I get to the big reveal that it's like, rah, I'm Tiamat, thinking we're just going to roll initiative. They literally were like, our new friend is Tiamat. Yes! And I was like, wait, are you guys serious? And they're like, yeah. And I roll insight, and she knows they're serious. And I had Tiamat just kind of be like the Dread Pirate Roberts, like, I might kill you tomorrow, but okay. I guess we're friends. And Tiamat ended up traveling with them for a while, and I ended up playing her like the Master from, Doctor Who. She was their bad angel. Like every time they went somewhere, like, we should help. She's like, should you help? Think about it. And it was that. So it not only informed that campaign, but it informed the way this character manifests ever since, up to and including now on Idle Champions. I'm doing the Trials of Mount Tiamat, and while she's the ultimate evil, for me, she's kind of this mischievous trickster because that's who she ended up becoming as a byproduct of the player's actions.
You gotta love it. You gotta love you do your big evil god reveal and everyone starts cheering and you're like, I don't get that a lot.
Yeah, they literally were like, yeah, woo! Like,
gotta feel good. I know you're big evil deity, but every once in a while I'll be like, oh, I showed you my true form and everyone cheered. That's what that feels like. Oh my God.
I kind of enjoyed that. I need a little more of that. Yeah. We got another one here from Grinth091. Hey, Brennan and B-Day. First, love your work. You have immaculate taste. Recently on LA by Night, it was so cool. How do you handle starting to wrap up a long 2.5 years by now campaign in a satisfying manner? Presumably they're talking about wrapping up LA by Night, which, that falls more on Jason than it does on us. But I've had to wrap up long games before in series and things that were coming to their conclusions. And I think I try to, more than anything, just make sure that it has an end, Like I point to the ending of Battlestar Galactica, which is, polarizing at best, but it ends. You know what I mean? You're like, this is where these characters are when the curtain goes down. I try to, in general, leave room where it's like, well, were the curtain ever to go up again, not counting maybe someone who dies, of course, but I try and bring it to all of these threads have come to as fulfilling a conclusion as I can give you. And, were it to branch out again on the other side, it might, but at least for now, this is where it's come, curtain. That's the way I look at it.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Wrapping up a story, and obviously Dimension 20 has shorter campaigns than a lot of other shows out there, but in a weird way, that's given us the most practice at ending stories. You know what I mean? Like in a short, we've been on the air for 3 years. Like I think in that time we've ended 10 seasons or something like that. Yep. And I think that like there's a certain degree. I had a great film professor who was talking also about like why you tell a story. It was a bunch of film students, all these, a bunch of like 19-year-olds trying to figure out what to say or do their student film. And there was some kid who was like, my pitch for my student film is it's about a film student that doesn't know what his student film should be about. And he's right.
That's the bag of holding and the bag of holding,
Yeah, it's
reality ruptures.
But the film professor literally was like, what did they say? It's like, you're at a dinner party. He's like, or you're at a water cooler or wherever. You're in a communal setting. Why would you start to tell a story in a social interaction? Why would you start to tell a story? Would you do it to hear your voice? Would you do it because you felt like probably it's time for you to tell a story? And you'd be like, no, those people are horribly rude. If someone who's just like, my turn to talk, you'd be like, that's rude. You share a story in a social setting because something someone said reminded you of it, or because it's germane to what you're talking about. Like someone said something and you're like, actually, you're saying that, but I have a story about something related to that shows a different facet or aspect to that. They're conversational, right? And the professor said, okay, so if you wouldn't, if that's your standard for telling a story for free at a dinner party, why wouldn't you have at least as high a standard for something you're going to spend $5,000 on? And everyone went, shit. We had this moment of like, yeah, the standard for making I have to have a little bit of something to say. So for me, I feel like thinking about the beginnings and ends of campaigns, I think it's similar to what you're saying of like, there's got to be a moment where the threads come back together, where like the ending, there's something the ending should do to show you why we started at the beginning, right? That like, it started here because this was the point where information started to accumulate that you needed to understand why we stopped here and vice versa. Like the endings and beginnings have to be mirrors of each other. There has to be something that goes like, hey, not every thread got wrapped up or not every single thing happened, but generally speaking, this creates a single unit of meaning. There's some meaning here that you can take away from this, that if we had ended earlier or started later, you'd be missing something.
Completely agree. Which is funny because we're talking about bringing up stories here, and we've gotten a lot of really great questions in. So I'm gonna dive in kind of hardcore into these. But I was just talking about you over the weekend at Gamehole Con during one of the panels I did, talking about Pirates of Leviathan, which if you haven't seen Pirates of Leviathan yet, it was great. It was me, it was Mercer, Marisha, Christina Ariel, Abria Iyengar, and Carlos Luna. And when the story opens, my character is with the bad guys. I found that out when you found that out. When he starts describing, like, here we are with Darth Vader and the Emperor and Dave. I'm like, okay, here we are. And very quickly into it, he's like, hey, do me a favor, kill Carlos. And I'm like, okay, like, here we go. This is apparently the game we're playing. Let's do it. Yeah, so stuff happens and hijinks ensue. I just want you to know.
But that's what we want. We want to see. We want to see the bugbear, who's the big bad guy, have a heart of gold and bring the little gold coin. I'm spoiling, but bring the little gold. You know the scene I'm talking about at the end. But we want, because seeing that turn, you can't see a turn if you're only seeing the second half. You have to see the first half. And specifically that too, I love it. Also, it was my fun little way because because B Dave is Mr. Empire and I'm Mr. Rebels, So I'm like, oh, you want to be a bad guy? You like the bad guys? Kill this kid.
Notice I said okay, like, yeah, watch Pirates of Leviathan on Dimension 20, kids. See where that goes, See where
it goes.
Exactly. I get set upon a hapless Carlos Luna in about the first 15 minutes of the show. So, yeah, that was a joy. Okay.
I love it.
Okay, so this is from Fade_ESQ, presumably that's Esquire. I'm wondering if you two have recommendations for books or movies or games for inspirations for DMs and world builders. I know I do.
Yeah. Recommendations for books, DMs, world builders.
Recommendations or movies or games for DMs and world builders. I'll just say two things because obviously I think we both could probably name 50 things. I would say there is actually a book on screenwriting called Save the Cat, which is the simplest introduction to storytelling structure. I will tell you that it is written in an insufferable tone because Blake Snyder was in love with his own genius, but he is right about the things that he is talking about. So just talking about how to arrange a narrative in a satisfying manner, I recommend that book. For the movies or TV, literally anything, and I'm going to tell you why, because when you start watching things, especially if it's in the genre of the story that you're trying to tell, start paying attention to what you like and what you don't like. A lot of times we just experience things and we have our reaction, but when you start becoming a storyteller, start unpacking it. Like, why did that work? Why was that so emotional? Why did Captain America catching Thor's hammer make everyone jump out of their chairs screaming and cheering? There was a long build-up to that. It wouldn't have made sense if they hadn't done it when they did it. Start unpacking in your mind how they did that. When things don't work, like the ending of Game of Thrones, and I can tell you why it didn't work, but we don't have time here. Start unpacking why it was unfulfilling, and then take those learnings and apply it to your story.
Right. So when I think about the ending of Game of Thrones, I get upset. It's very, very true. I also think even going back to the books of Game of Thrones, there's an interesting because I was talking about like beginnings and endings matching each other. At a certain point in the Game of Thrones books, you start to realize like we didn't need to start at the beginning. That's when I stopped reading the Game of Thrones books, is when I went, we didn't need to start at the beginning. So many of the people that we started with are dead now. And their stories didn't resolve like, in other words, we're really watching a documentary about Westeros. We're not in a story anymore, which I could go on a whole tear about how
friends of the show know George R.R. Martin is dead to me. Yeah, but that we'll get you back and we'll just talk about just that, Brennan.
Just rip on him and be like, oh, we like, because you can deconstruct fairy tales and fantasy and be like, this isn't how it would really happen. Yeah, I know it's not how it would really happen. I don't have time to just live in Westeros and the real world. I'd like it bite-sized, Mr. R.R. Martin.
Why it's called fantasy. Yeah, but sorry.
Why it's called fantasy. Hey. There's recommendations I'd make. Often people that are looking for recommendations are looking for something very tactile, I find. Brandon Sanderson has a bunch of great YouTube lectures that are available for free online where he really there you go, where he really goes ham on world building, down to like talking about how your magic system works. And our mutual buddy, Patrick Rothfuss, has an incredible world building that you can dive into. What I would say, and this is, I don't know if this is controversial to say or not, but what I would say is this, something to bear in mind is that there are different schools of thought, right? And world building, a lot of the people I see holding forth on conversations and world building in online spaces get really into the nitty-gritty of the logistics of world building. And that's all well and good. But something that you should bear in mind is that the greatest feats of world building in fantasy literature and storytelling make zero goddamn sense. So, be aware, you go to Middle Earth and you're like, oh my God, look at all these languages, this beautiful prose, all these songs. Tolkien was a linguist. So that's why all this language stuff is there. Tolkien also created a world where technology hasn't improved and is in fact like gotten worse over thousands of years. Someone 2,000 years ago made the best sword ever. No one's been able to figure out a better sword since then. How fucking depressing. If you're a blacksmith in Middle Earth, how do you get out of bed in the morning? Crazy, right? Not how technology works. Also, not of, I'll just bring up other fantasy properties around, like we see that it doesn't have to make sense to do something that world building needs to do, which is to hit some kind of aesthetic note, some kind of, it hits a tuning fork somewhere and something takes off in your mind. So I would say to people that are doing world building, be careful not to get lost in the sauce of where you're like, like my river system is completely geo-accurate. The water tables, they all make sense. You can get lost.
I always tell people, no one cares about your 15,000 years of history. If Tolkien had written the Silmarillion before The Hobbit, none of us would know that man's name.
Correct.
The best example ever is for 1,000 generations, the Jedi were the peacekeepers of the Old Republic. That's it.
Yes.
That sentence has borne thousands of hours of content, but that is all you needed to know. And then you can reveal through the narrative, you can reveal through subsequent stories, there's a million ways you can explore it later, but I 100% agree with that. I recently did a podcast with Keith Baker, though, where he brought up a really interesting point, at least when you're designing worlds and systems and magic. You have to think about some of the implications of these things. When he created Eberron, he intentionally made it low magic, because the thing that he said that was so thought-provoking to me is he was like, let's say resurrection magic really exists. You can die and come back. As we all know, death is in many ways simply past a certain level merely an inconvenience in D&D, where you're like, died again, oh well, must be Tuesday, but in a world where that's really true, he's like, then the people who control the world are not the people who control the resurrection magic. They're the people that control the diamonds, because whoever's got the diamonds controls life and death, and it was like, you're right. You're right. tons of these questions. I would say to, we'll attempt to speed through some of these things, but I think you and I don't do speeding. But I will say this: I got a number of questions. They're like, can you tell us what's coming next for this show? Can you tell us what's coming next for this product? Y'all know we can't, even if we wanted to. NDA, but the WotC lasers and Dimension 20 lasers will start appearing on all of us. Both of us have stuff coming. Let's put it like that. We've got stuff coming. I appreciate your curiosity, but although I did, this is a really good one here from GWiz138. What's the best way for getting comfortable with RPing intense scenes like Adrian's with your friends? Does that comfort just come with time and trust, or is it mostly because of your improv training?
That's an interesting question. I would say that's a great question. I would say time, trust, and also context. We're creating an actual play show, and Eric is one of the most gifted actors in the world, right? So there's a context there of like, hey, if you go ham here, that's appreciated. Everyone here, you have a relationship with this. So I think it's all of the above is really the answer, right? If you trust people, it's easier. If you are working with trained actors, it's easier. If you know that the context of what you're creating is, hey, this is the second to last episode. Like they tell you that at the beginning. This is the second to last episode, right? All that context makes it easier to go to that intense place. That being said, even when I was doing home games, it became clear that our intention was to live inside a story. That our highest point of interest was, what if you could live in the moment from Lord of the Rings, from Princess Bride, from this or from that or from that? What if you could live in those moments and get to the same places those people got to? I had a conversation with an indie game designer friend of mine recently who was talking about incentivizing role playing. And he was like, well, you need games that incentivize role playing. And I remember saying, like, frankly, I don't. Yeah. Incentivizing role playing, what do you mean? That's incentivizing the incentive.
Yeah.
I play these games to get lost in the characters. I play these games so that me and my friends can look around and be like, we were really there in the story for that scene. Our room faded away and we were in that palace in the underworld. We were on that ship sailing over the seas. So it's an interesting thing because I think for me, the feeling of, and I recognize that it's the same thing, whether I've been doing LARPing or I've been doing D&D or I was doing improv on stage, there's a moment where you get lost in flow state and suddenly your ego dissolves and you are in another world for moments at a time, right? You are in another world. That's the goal. So for me, that has been the objective for a long, long time. And I think it's about having conversations with your groups to say, like, is this the objective for all of us? Because obviously, if people aren't looking for that kind of intense role play thing, you don't want to like spring that on people, or like you want to have some agreement about what the objective is. But yeah, for me and the people that I've been playing with for my whole life, that's always been the objective.
Yeah, you got to make sure everybody's playing the same game, because it's not always. And I don't just mean D&D. The person that is looking for to be a murder hobo, playing a very, tactical 5 foot of movement, war game simulation with someone else that is looking to play the intense narrative of, political intrigue and ennui. At the risk of mixing metaphors, in Vampire, we refer to them as the trench coat katana guys. There's the people that are coming to, weave their spider's web of politics in the Elysium, and there's the guy that is a huge fan of Blade. And those people are playing 2 different games. And with skill, the storyteller can meet both of their needs over the course of the narrative, but that all has to be communicated. And remember that not every table is for every player, not every player is for every table. That being said, I will say, I think the most important thing to this is the lines and veils, that everybody has kind of, made it known in advance where they are and are not comfortable going.
Yeah.
At least the storyteller should be aware, even if because not everybody wants everyone to know their phobia or their, why something bothers them. But the storyteller should be capable of adjudicating if it's going a certain way. And, consent is sexy. I just had a game recently where my character had to profess their previously unprofessed love for another character. But I talked to that person in advance and was like, hey, look, this is the way I'm looking to go with this. Is that okay with you? And they were like, yeah, of course. I completely agree that what you were saying, that it's drama and horror are defined and predicated by trust.
Yeah.
Because you must let your guard down to a certain extent. And I, as a person, I don't have a lot of trouble with bleed. Not really. We can be yelling and screaming at each other and the camera stops and I'm okay. Yeah, no, let's, that's lunch, but, one, not everybody's like that. And two, things can, it can get intense, and it's just safety, trusting that it's like, you're not actually trying to harm me,
Yeah.
You at no point are you actually trying to harm me. You and I are telling a story together.
Yeah.
That's
I dig it. Yeah, I think it is very important. That thing, bleed is an interesting thing, because I think there's certain words get coined that then take on a negative connotation. And I think bleed is one of those words where people are like, hey, we need to be aware of character bleed, because it's possible, brains are a wild thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're yelling in character, part of your brain is still releasing cortisol. Mm-hmm. Just yelling will release cortisol. So you'll have a stress thing go up. And, it's just your job as a person to be like, hey, I'm going to feel the effects of stress in my body. I need to know that that's the point. That's what I'm going for. Mm-hmm. But there's an interesting thing that happens where people will go like, hey, be careful and be aware of character bleed when it happens. That can suddenly become in especially online discourse spaces. It's like, bleed is bad. Don't bleed. Don't have character bleed. And you're like, well, actually, for a lot of us, character bleed is the point. we're trying to have that feeling of like, wow, when my character was scared, I felt scared. When my character was happy, I cried happy tears. That's what we're pursuing. So it's one of those things of, once again, it can be oversimplified. The nuance can get lost. You want a situation where you are always supporting you and your play. Me and Erica have a ton of check-ins like that. We have those intense scenes, and then there'll be a little, we'll do the little okay we'll do the little okay symbol. And all that's great, because you just want to have that check-in.
It's a catharsis, and it's a catharsis not just for us, but for the audience, especially during this time of pandemic when everybody's been so bottled up. I know we're short on time. I don't want to go too far into it, but I did a Wraith 4-shot that's up on Q Times, Wraith the Oblivion. And, in that game, you play two characters. You have your character and you have someone else's shadow. And their shadow is everything that they're not proud of. Every secret they ever kept, everything they ever did wrong, that's the shadow. And the shadow hates you. And so over the course of these 4 episodes, they just beat the hell out of each other, man. They said things that I never would have even thought of, much less said out loud. They were awful to each other, and it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. But we get to the ends of the episodes where all these super heavy things would happen, and everybody'd be like, but I actually feel good. Why do I feel good? And it's like, that's the catharsis. You just let it out. It just came out.
Bringing it back full circle to improv, when people start doing improv scenes, one of the first things we have to talk about is people not doing fighting scenes where they're fighting at each other. We say that because people love it and do it all the time. People love to come out and be like, you stupid, everybody, it's universal. People love to scream. Why? Because they're suddenly in a position where you can yell at somebody and you're not in trouble. You will have a situation where you go like, oh, and it's the word cathartic is absolutely what it is. Because in real life, when you're in a screaming fight, the stakes are so incredibly high. It feels awful. At least for me, anytime I've ever been in a situation where someone was yelling at me, it's like, this is terrible. I hate this. But in that moment where suddenly it's like, this is all play. We have the foam gloves on. It's really intoxicating for people. And I think that that aspect of this is something that is less about tabletop games and more about performance in general. There is catharsis in performance. When you are in that space, you suddenly get a chance to be like, oh, I can like tap into an emotion that I never let myself feel and feel it, which is very freeing, especially for a lot of people that are like swallowing their feelings most of the time.
That, you know, that's, we're short on time here. And like I said, we could talk for an hour about any of these things, but I have found in my experience, that is the actual real strength of the World of Darkness in particular. Because the line between that world and this world is so thin, it's much easier to put on that character's mask, you know? Like, you're here. That gas station on the corner is on the corner. That City Hall is City Hall. And you just happen to be a monster. Let's go. Whereas in D&D, you still can very much have those emotional moments, but there's more gates. You know, like I got to keep track of the fact that I'm a half-orc and what that means. Okay, I'm a paladin. What does that mean? Okay, I'm in Waterdeep. That's cool too. You know what I mean? And it's almost like more insulation to getting to the thing, you know, that the World of Darkness is a lot less of that. You know, some of us, there may be no difference between us and our characters. Let me just say this last one, and we don't have enough time to do it proper justice. And I'm going to paraphrase this one. Do you ever, are there ever stories that you feel particularly self-conscious about telling, or maybe unqualified for? What they were getting at was like prominently like a minority or LGBTQ question or stories or something like that. Like I said, I'm paraphrasing, but you know, are there ever stories that you feel wary of telling?
Oh, constantly, of course. Knowing that you are telling the right story is a huge part of being an ethical storyteller. There have been like Dimension 20 ideas. There have been like ideas back when I was writing comics. There have been writing throughout my whole life where, having done a sensitivity consultation, I would tell people like, hey, if this idea is bad, this is why it's so important to bring consultation in early in the development of an idea. Because I've had people be like, oh, like there's so many issues with this type of story. It might just not be your story to tell. And then you don't tell that story. It's an incredible thing. You don't have to do it. If it's a bad idea, you just don't do that story. There are obviously interesting issues that arise because as a dungeon master, you have to depict a inclusive and welcoming world, even though you as a dungeon master occupy a singular identity. Like for me as a white dude, you know, especially doing like magical New York, where like you're saying, our Unsleeping City campaign, which is I think the one where you came in and consulted for the first time, was that one where I went like, hey, this is not like welcome to the realm of, you know, of Waterdeep or whatever. This is a world that has our real world history. It also has this magical history to it, but it has our real world history in it, right? And I can't depict a New York City that is not as diverse and inclusive and alive as real New York is. But in so doing, I have this tremendous responsibility. You know, like I had, you know, Lou Wilson and Zach Oyama, who were going to be playing, you know, a black man from Harlem and a Japanese American fighter, and had families in the city. And they're like, my families are, shocker here, related to me, right? So there's this whole element, I think, of this broad spectrum of knowing all of the areas of lack of knowledge, lack of insight, lack of awareness, and not taking like your good intention as the thing that's going to get the job done, but it being like real research, real time, real investment, real consultation, taking everything seriously, making those points of inclusion and welcoming your number one priority in creating and depicting the setting. And then past that, also giving, especially like telling your consultants like, hey, I know that there's this dynamic where you maybe have worked with other people where they were like, look, just give us the notes so that we can stay out of hot water. And really getting away from that kind of gross instinct to be like, hey, screw hot water. If this is not a good idea for us to pursue this type of story, please tell that to me. I'm not looking for like a rubber stamp. I'm looking for actual feedback to maybe either not do this or do this as responsibly as it can be done. So I think that that's a really important thing for creators, to be very diligent and rigorous in holding themselves to the highest possible standard.
I can definitely say I've had people contact me or work on projects and they were like, how can we do this? I'm like, don't. Yeah. Do not do that thing. Let me say this one last thing and we're pretty much at time. Look at that. That's how it flies, man. You know?
Wild.
We had a number of questions we didn't answer, but we alluded to most of them, and the ones we didn't allude to, like I said, when you start getting into like what's the next product release or something, like, come on, you know, I get you asking. But there's one that I'm actually just going to cut straight to the answer, and they were saying, you know, people say the DM should just start, but what happens when you don't know the rules very well and you encounter a rules lawyer, basically? I'm going to keep this super simple because I got 18 seconds. I got less than 18 seconds because we're at time. The rules exist to facilitate the story and not the other way around. So tell your story to the best of your ability. Apply the rules to the best of your ability. If you need to stop and look something up, that's okay. You see me do it all the time. That's why this is right here. I know this game very well, and I still will be like, let me just double check. Okay, it's this. Boom. And if worst case, you make a ruling on the field. If you say the wrong thing, you fix it later. And if Captain Neckbeard wants to be like, that's not how this works, either, well, now, for the sake of the story, yeah, it is, because the story has to come first, or, hey, thanks, I didn't have the 5th edition wording of Finger of Death committed to memory. I understand now, you know, roll this save instead, and the world keeps turning. Don't let that be an obstacle. Yes, do start. With that being said, I thank you all for tuning in. Like I said, come back tomorrow, 9 a.m. for our first dev update with Adam Bradford and a major announcement. But I'm going to give it to you, Brennan, parting thought and where people can find you.
What a joy to be here. Always a pleasure to talk with you, B-Dave. You can find me at Brennan LM on Twitter. You can find me at Brennan Lee Mulligan on Instagram. You can find Dimension 20 at youtube.com/Dimension20 show, where we have a bunch of seasons out for free. And the stuff that's not for free, you can find on dropout.tv.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah. So much more to say. So again, this like when we talk, we just do this and we do it for a very long time. So I'm glad you guys got to join us. We got to do it again, Brennan.
I love it. Yes, anytime.
All right. Thank you guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Okay.